Good afternoon, Miamians. I'm Molly Young from the Miami University Alumni Association, and today, as part of the Alumni Association's webinar series, we present the second session on the Ghent Altarpiece. Joining us again this afternoon to tell us all about it is Dr. Stephen Wainscott, class of 77, Professor Emeritus and Director Emeritus of the Honors College of Clemson University. Welcome, Steve. Thanks for joining us again today. Just as a reminder for our live viewers out there, you can submit questions, comments, feedback, or anything else of the like throughout the webinar by clicking the Ask a Question button under your video. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Steve to get us started again today. Thanks, Steve. Welcome.
Well, thank you, Molly. It's great to be back with you again. As I say, we're going to do something a little bit different today. And I think if you like crime novels, I think you're really going to enjoy this. Now, one other thing is I made some changes in the two presentation to include a couple of slides I didn't have last time, but we had a little bit of a technical difficulty. So we're going to go back to my original presentation. But before we get into this, I'd like to address a question that one of our viewers posed last week. It was a question about the restorations of the Ghent Altarpiece. And to answer this, we need to distinguish between restorations on the one hand and conservations or preservations on the other. Throughout history, there have been numerous conservations or preservations of the altarpiece that have involved overpainting of small parts and the application of varnishes to recover to repair or cover up cracking, yellowing, and other signs of aging. There have also been some conservations that involve the removal of yellowed protective coatings, one of which I'll mention near the end of today's program. However, there have been only 3 restorations we know of. The first one was in 1550, according to some historian, but we really don't know the scope of it. The second was in 1950 to repair damage to the altarpiece that had been sustained during its storage by the Germans in an Austrian salt mine. The most recent one, which I'll also talk about at the end of today's presentation, took place over a 12-year period from 2012 to 2024 to restore the entire altarpiece to its original color. Also, when I did this presentation on a previous occasion, an interesting question came up as to whether there was a particular sequence in the paintings of the various panels. And that is, the question would be, were there some panels that were painted first? Were there some that were painted last? Others in between? And the answer is there's really no evidence of this. Most art historians believe that the panels were painted pretty much somewhat concurrently. So, getting into our presentation, the Mystic Lamb's Rocky Road. The art historian Noah Charney said this: since its completion in 1432, the altarpiece has disappeared. It's been looted in 3 wars. It's been burned, dismembered, copied, forged, smuggled, illegally sold, censored, attacked by iconoclasts, ransomed, rescued, and stolen. It's the most desired art object of all time, and as a result, it's the most victimized. So for the first 134 years of the altarpiece's existence, it was safe and secure in its home in the Ghent Cathedral. That began to change during the Protestant Reformation of the mid-16th century, and particularly in the Beeldenstorm of 1566 depicted here. Roughly translated, Beeldenstorm simply means attack on images. The territory that would become Belgium was an epicenter of Calvinist radicalism. Cathedrals throughout the country were prime targets of the iconoclasts. These were mobs that sought to destroy religious objects they considered to be blasphemous. And we'll see here, one target was the Our Lady Cathedral in Antwerp. All of its magnificent stained glass was destroyed. This is the cathedral at Tournai. It was also a target of the iconoclasts, and this a wonderful structure here. It's very unusual in that it has 5 spires. However, the Ghent Altarpiece was especially denounced as an example of what the iconoclasts regard as the 3 errors of Catholicism: prayer to an icon, meaning the Lamb; the extravagances of the Catholic Church; and the sale of indulgences, the notion that one could buy one's way out of purgatory and into heaven. And we'll actually see this depicted here, if you remember this from the Ghent Altarpiece panel. This is Jos Veit, who was the contributor to the cathedral and also commissioned the Ghent Altarpiece. The iconoclasts saw this as a visual representation of the practice of the sale of indulgences. And if you could look more closely than this, you could see his purse showing off his wealth. Well, when the Calvinists rioted in Ghent in 1566, they smashed the stained glass windows and destroyed numerous paintings and also sculptures, but officials at the cathedral had hidden the altarpiece panels in the cathedral tower out of view. Knowing that the iconoclasts would likely return, they later moved the panels to a safer location in the basement of Ghent's town hall. Moving up a couple of centuries, during the French Revolution and Napoleonic era, there were 2 new developments in the world of art. First was the creation of public art museums. Until then, the possession of art had been a privilege of the crown, the church, and the nobility. With the Reign of Terror, members of the nobility lost not only their heads to the guillotine, but also their art treasures to public museums. For example, the Louvre. Until 1792, it was a royal palace. The second development during this period was the practice of state-sponsored art theft. Now, no country was innocent of art theft. For example, the Rosetta Stone was first stolen from Egypt by the French and was later stolen from the French by the British. But the looting of art by Napoleon's armies was unparalleled. Entire battalions were assigned to steal artworks and transfer them to Paris. And you'll see here an example. No, this is one of the glitches we had. I had a slide here, which unfortunately doesn't show up here, of Napoleon gloating at his stealing of a statue of Apollo. I apologize, we couldn't get that in here. Now, on to this presentation. In 1822, a fire in the chapel of St. Bavo caused damage to the central panel of the altarpiece. It created a crack such that the panel had to be restored. That crack remains visible today if you can get up close enough to see it. The repainted section included the head of the lamb, and if you look closely, you can see it has at least 3 ears and possibly 4. In 1861, the Adam and Eve panels of the altarpiece were stolen, suspected by a corrupt official of the church, and were taken to Berlin. Emperor Franz Joseph apparently didn't share Van Eyck's appreciation of the unidealized nude, So he ordered the original panels removed and replaced by copies of Adam and Eve discreetly clothed in bearskins. And these panels are still on display outside the chapel in St. Bavo Cathedral. Moving on the eve of the First World War, there was heated debate about whether artworks were legitimate spoils of war. Most scholars argue that historic buildings and art treasures should be off limits to victorious armies, but the invading German armies thought otherwise. This is the central library of the University of Leuven. In September 1914, just 1 month into the First World War, the university town of Leuven, Belgium, was bombed by the invading German armies, and its central library was burned along with 250,000 books, many of which were original and single-volume medieval texts. Church officials at St. Bavo in Ghent were afraid that the advancing German armies would do to Ghent as they did to Leuven. And in the slide here, you'll see the central library that was reconstructed after the war. The project was overseen by then Treasury Secretary Herbert Hoover and was largely financed by donations from U.S. colleges and universities. Canon Gabriel Vandengane, seen here on the left with his bishop, was the custodian of the cathedral's artworks. He came up with a scheme to remove the altarpiece panels and hide them in locations throughout the city that would be known only to him and 3 accomplices. The bishop was not to know the details of the scheme because he would be the person questioned if the Germans came to St. Bavo with the intent of taking the Ghent Altarpiece panels. Vandegane's plan was to fake a disturbance at a crosstown shop. With the police diverted to investigate, Vandengane and his accomplices went to the cathedral, removed the altarpiece panels, packed them in crates, then put them on horse-drawn carts and covered the carts with household junk. They then hid the panels in places on their way out of Ghent. The canon said to the bishop, "If the Germans come here for the panels, give them this." What he did was he had obtained letterhead from the Ministry of Fine Arts. He forged a few sentences stating it was the order of the Belgian government to ship the altarpiece panels to London. He then forged the minister's signature and gave the letter to the bishop. When the Germans arrived, they riddled the bishop with questions. What was the name of the person who took possession of the panels? What was the name of the ship? What was the name of the captain? And the bishop could honestly say he didn't know, and the panels were saved. In the 1919 Treaty of Versailles ending the First World War, Article 247 addressed the replacement of cultural property destroyed or stolen by Germany during the war. It focused on the University of Leuven's library, requiring Germany to provide replacements for destroyed manuscripts. Additionally, it mandated the return of specific art pieces to Belgium, including panels from the Ghent Altarpiece. And so for the first time in more than 100 years, all of the panels were reunited. On April 11th, 1934, one of the greatest mysteries in the history of art occurred when the St. John and the Baptist and the Just Judges panels were found missing. At the time, it was regarded as the art crime of the century, and the search for it became and continues to be a Belgian version of the Da Vinci Code. There was a note pinned to the frame, stolen from Germany by the Treaty of Versailles, which suggested an act of revenge by the Nazis. And I should note here that Hitler coveted the Ghent Altarpiece more than any other work of art, and I'll be telling you more about that later. Three weeks later, after the panels were found missing, the bishop received a letter mysteriously signed D.U.A. The letter also demanded 1 million francs for the return of the panels. So it appeared that the note about the Treaty of Versailles was a hoax, not an act of revenge, but a crime for money. In other words, a ransom scheme. At first, the bishop expressed willingness to pay the ransom, but the Belgian courts blocked him. 1 month later, a second letter arrived along with a luggage receipt for a package at the North train station in Brussels. There, the police found the St. John panel and another note that stated in effect, "This proves that we have the judge's panel and that we are acting in good faith." The letter then repeated the ransom demand. In November 1934, a 13th and final letter blasted the bishop for stalling. It stated, "We have come to a dead end. The immortal masterpiece will disappear forever. No one, not even us, will be able to see the judges. It will remain where it is, in a resting place, without anyone being able to lay hands on it without drawing attention." And that seemed to be the end of it. But six weeks later, at a meeting of a radical Catholic party, a stockbroker and locally known artist named Arsène Godertier was giving a fiery speech when he collapsed from an apparent heart attack. He was rushed to his apartment, and gasping for breath, he ordered everyone out of his room except for his lawyer, to whom he said, "I am the only one who knows where the judge's panel is. In my study. In the armoire. The key." And then he died. Immediately, there were thoughts of a cover-up, because from the time the police were notified of the theft of one of Belgium's greatest art treasures, it took them 3 hours to show up. They claim they've been delayed by investigating a theft at a cheese shop. Upon arriving, they looked around for a few minutes, asked a few questions, but they took no notes, no photographs, and made no check for fingerprints. And then they left to return to the cheese shop. Adding to the conspiracy theory, Godertier's lawyer didn't go to the police until a month after Godertier's death, and even then the police didn't do anything for yet another month. When they finally searched Godertier's apartment, they found some interesting things. Copies of the 13 ransom letters and a draft of an unsent 14th letter. They found a passport that had Godertier's photo on it, but issued to a person named Armand van Dam. Could that mean D-U-A backwards? They also found a luggage ticket from the train station with the initials AVD, Armand van Dam supposedly. And at the station in the locker, they found a typewriter matching the type of the ransom letters. Police then returned to Godertier's apartment, to quiz his servant, who said that he had become angry when she found him wrapping a flat object she described as approximately 5 feet by 2 feet, which would be about the dimensions of the Just Judges panel. She also said that Gudurtier was an avid reader of art crime novels, his favorite being The Hollow Needle, the main character of which was a detective named Arsène Lupin, the same first name as Gudurtier. So it should seem clear that Gudurtier was involved in the theft, but his exact role is unknown. It's unlikely he stole the panels by himself because he was morbidly obese and he had trouble breathing, so he couldn't possibly have hefted panels weighing more than 250 pounds. He also had poor vision and had trouble seeing in dark places. A dark place is a place such as an unlit cathedral in the middle of the night. One explanation of the theft of the judges' panel has been called the investment group theory. It contends that Gudurtier, a stockbroker, had been a member of a club that collected donations from wealthy Catholics for charities approved by the bishop. In early 1934, so the theory goes, the group got wind of a promising venture that required raising a lot of money, but very, very fast. But it was bad timing. Due to the Depression, the bank holding the group's assets collapsed. And so it's been contended that the group then panicked and schemed to recoup their losses by stealing the Just Judges panel and ransoming it. It's also been conjectured that the scheme was concocted with the knowledge and approval of the bishop himself. A rival theory holds that it was a Nazi plot after all, and that the ransom letters were simply a decoy to throw the investigation off track. In 1940, 6 years after the disappearance of the judges' panel, and with no prospects for its recovery, the cathedral commissioned a local artist, Jeff van der Weken, seen here, to recreate it. We'll come back to this a little bit later, but first let's continue with the Nazi plot theory. When Germany invaded Belgium in 1940, there were renewed fears of the looting of art treasures. The fears were based upon 3 factors. First, as we've learned, Nazi revenge for the humiliation of the Treaty of Versailles. And second, it was well known that Hitler was obsessed with the altarpiece. He and many of his henchmen were fascinated with the occult and were convinced that the altarpiece held clues to the whereabouts of the Arma Christi. The Arma Christi meaning artifacts from the crucifixion of Christ, the nails, the robe, the crown of thorns, and so forth. And third, the Allies had learned that special German army units had been created and deployed to confiscate works of art and to take them to Germany for supposed safekeeping. Knowing all this, the Belgian government tried to relocate art treasures, including the altarpiece, to the Vatican in Rome. But on the way there, Italy entered the war on Germany's side, so the caravan was diverted to a chateau in the south of France. When the Germans learned of this, they went there and had the artworks, including the altarpiece, taken to the Louvre in Paris. On learning of the German army's looting, President Roosevelt created the Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archives Commission, informally known as the Monuments Men. These were 300 people from civilian jobs. They included architects, artists, curators, art historians, and so forth. The story of the Monuments Men is told in a book by Robert Edsel and in a film directed by and starring George Clooney. And I'll simply tell you the book is a lot better than the movie. The Monuments Men had a twofold mission. First was to follow behind the advancing U.S. forces to protect historic buildings and art treasures from further damage. Second, they were to act as detectives, searching for art stolen by the Nazis. As for the Ghent Altarpiece, the monuments were sure the panels had been taken to Germany or to German occupied territory, but where? In the spring of 1945, the end of the war was in sight, but the Allies feared that the retreating German armies would destroy art treasures because Hitler had issued his so-called Nero decree, whereby German field commanders were ordered to destroy anything that could be of use to the Allies. That would include railroads, supply depots, grain silos, factories, and so forth. The question was, could the Nero decree also include the destruction of art? If so, could the advancing Allies save the works from being destroyed? In this slide here, you'll see Monuments Men Captain Robert Posey. He was an architect from Alabama. You'll also see Private Lincoln Kirstein, who is an art connoisseur and founder of the New York Ballet. They were on patrol in Western Austria when Posey had an excruciating toothache. When he was finally able to see a local dentist, the dentist asked the two of them, "What do you do in your American army?" When they responded that they were searching for stolen art, the Austrian dentist said, "You might want to meet my son-in-law." The son-in-law was Hermann Bunges. He was an Harvard-educated former SS officer and an art advisor to Hermann Göring, who was Hitler's second in command. At first, Bunges was afraid to talk to Posey and Kirstein out of fear that if his SS past were to become known to his townspeople, he and his family could be in danger. But eventually, Bunges opened up and told Posey and Kirstein two very interesting things. One, Hitler was planning to build a super museum in his hometown of Linz, Austria, where he intended to collect and display all the world's greatest artworks. The second thing that Bunges told them, there was a huge cache of stolen art in a nearby salt mine outside of the town of Altarpiece in the Austrian Alps. And this is Altarpiece as you can see it today. The mine commandant was August Eyck. He was a fanatic Nazi who idolized Hitler and even tried to look like him. Before becoming commandant of the salt mine, he was commandant of the Mauthausen concentration camp. After the war, he was tried for war crimes and was hanged. Eyck interpreted Hitler's Nero decree to mean that the mine was to be destroyed to prevent the artworks from being captured by the Americans. And here you can see Eyck with Hitler looking over Hitler's plan for his Uber Museum in Linz. The chief civilian engineer of the mine was a person by the name of Emmerich Pockmuller, and I'm sorry that I was unable to find a picture of him. Pockmuller was determined to save the artworks in the salt mine from being destroyed, and he felt that Eyck had badly misinterpreted Hitler's Nero decree. So he pleaded with Eyck not to blow up the mine. Eyck angrily responded that he knew Hitler's mine better than Pockmuller and told him to stand by for the order to blow up the mine. The next day, Pockmuller was on his daily inspection when he observed workers taking 8 large crates into the mine, each of them marked, "Attention, marble contents do not drop." Curious, he went into the mine and opened a crate. Instead of finding marble, he found a high explosive aerial bomb weighing 1,200 pounds. Searching through the rest of the mine, he found 7 other crates, each with a bomb. And he knew that if they were detonated, the mine and all of its art contents would be completely destroyed. So Pockmuller schemed to pretend compliance with Eygruber's order while saving the contents of the mine. His scheme was highly risky because if it were to become known to Eygruber, he would have been shot on the spot. What Pockmuller did was he had the high explosive bombs removed from the mine and replaced them just inside the mine's entrance with smaller palsy bombs. These are small bombs that produce merely a concussion effect. He then reported to Eygruber that everything was set for the detonation. When Posey and Kirstein finally got to the mine, the Nazis were gone, and the mine appeared to be destroyed. But after clearing away the rubble, they found that the small palsy bombs had only sealed the mine's entrance. When the nearby American troops arrived, the entrance was cleared and all the mine's contents were found intact. About a mile into the tunnel, they came to an iron door. They opened it, and there was the Ghent Altarpiece in all its glory. 2 days later, Germany surrendered. The Ghent Altarpiece was the first work of art removed from the mine and returned to its native country. The only passenger on the plane taking it back to Brussels was Captain Robert Posey. Inside the Altarpiece salt mine, more than 17,000 art treasures were rescued from the mine. That included 6,500 paintings. Most of them were marked AH for Hitler's museum. And I might explain here why a salt mine. It turns out that the salt mine created the perfect climatic conditions for the preservation of art. A constant 48 degrees, relative humidity of only 40%, and most of the tunnels were 700 and 800 feet deep, but protected them from aerial bombing. And now I'll show you a few scenes from inside the mine. The statue on the right is the Bruges Madonna. And there they found the Ghent Altarpiece. And now I want to tell you a little bit of a side story. The person here is Rose Valland, a French woman who in her early life simply aspired to be an art teacher. But she became an assistant curator of the Jeu de Paume Museum in Paris. While there, she spied on the Nazis at the museum who were looting artworks and taking them to Germany. Valland secretly wrote down the numbers and routes of the trains carrying the artworks and warned the French resistance of their whereabouts so they wouldn't be fired on. She had spent 10 years in Germany and become fluent in the language, but she had to be very careful not to lapse into speaking German, lest this would identify her as a spy. Fallon collaborated with the monuments men to help them locate stolen art. After the war, she played a key role in having more than 60,000 artworks returned to France and to their home countries. Her role in the recovery of stolen art is depicted in this 1964 film, The Train. Also in The Monuments Men, she is played by the actress Cate Blanchett. She's the most decorated woman in French history. In March 1974, a local art conservator, Jos Trotijn, was doing his annual cleaning of the altarpiece when he suddenly stopped. Something about the Just Judges panel, the copy, didn't look right. The copy done by Jeff van der Weyken in 1940 showed the same signs of yellowing, cracking, and other signs of aging as the 23 other panels painted 5.5 centuries earlier. Also, he noticed something odd about one of the figures in the panel. It seemed that there was a face that was ghosted underneath another face. So he called a friend of his, who was also a fellow conservator. And after looking at the panel for a while, they agreed if after only 34 years, the outer paint of the copy had faded so as to expose an earlier figure, then the 1940 copy by van der Weyken wasn't a copy after all, but the original panel just painted over. If so, that could mean that the original panel never left the cathedral in the first place. And that could possibly mean that the bishop himself was complicit in the 1934 ransom scheme. When Trotijn approached the bishop with his idea that the copy was the original just touched up a little bit, he was stonewalled. But when Trotijn threatened to go to the authorities, the bishop reluctantly agreed to bring in a team of conservators. A few weeks later, without mentioning any findings or evidence, the bishop simply announced that the panel was a copy. Case closed. And that gave rise to renewed suspicions of a cover-up. In May 2010, a preservation team founded by the Getty Foundation began. The main purpose was to try to undo centuries of incompetent cleaning and overpainting. A second purpose, not the main one, was to determine once and for all that the Just Judges panel was the original painting or a copy. The Getty Foundation found that it was a copy, which means that the original Just Judges panel is still out there somewhere, if it hasn't been destroyed. In Belgium, few subjects excite people more than the mystery of the Just Judges. It's comparable to theories of JFK's assassination in the US, or the Belgian equivalent of the Loch Ness Monster. Hardly a month passes by without new theories about its hiding place. For example, let's go back to that 13th ransom letter that stated that the panel is in a, quote, resting place, where it can't be removed without, quote, drawing attention. Could such a resting place be a cemetery? If so, could the panel be found in Godurtier's grave? At one time it was thought so. But in 1996, someone robbed Godurtier's grave and made off with his skull. Could the thief have made off with the Judge's panel as well? Well, let's go back to the Nazi plot theory for a minute. One version of this theory possibly involves Canon van den Gate, the hero who supposedly saved the altarpiece in the First World War. It's been speculated that he learned about the theft and the whereabouts of the Just Judges panel from Gerdurtier during a confession. And so, being true to his vows of silence, Van den Gane never told anyone. When the Germans invaded Belgium in 1940, so the theory goes, Van den Gane removed the panel to a location known only to him. But did the canon not tell anyone because he was being true to his vows of silence? Or because he'd become a Nazi collaborator? Another theory holds that the panel is still in the cathedral, and one day a tourist or one of my study abroad students will stumble upon it. That's not likely. There have been 6 full-scale searches of St. Bavo. In 1998, a retired detective received a $1 million grant to x-ray the cathedral to a depth of 30 feet. Nothing was turned up. So if it's not a cathedral, could it be somewhere else in Ghent or elsewhere in Belgium? Here are some places where it's been speculated the Just Judges panel might be. In 2002, police in Brussels, acting on an anonymous tip, searched St. Hubert's Chapel in Tervuren outside Brussels. Nothing was found. In 2004, a retired taxi driver and amateur detective, Gaston de Roque, seen here, posted tips on a website claiming the panel was behind a wall in a church in Ghent where Gerdurtier attended and was an organist. Nothing was found. There have been numerous instances when, acting on a tip, streets have been dug up in an effort to find the missing panel. I was there for one of those. In all, more than 400 locations suggested by locals have been investigated. Each year, St. Bavo Cathedral receives from the Department of Justice a file with tips and leads, all of which, by law, must be followed up. None have panned out. Every time I went to Belgium, newspapers contained articles about the latest theories as to where the Just Judges panel might be found. In 2012, an ambitious project was begun to restore the Ghent Altarpiece in its entirety to its original splendor. It involved removing varnish and overpainting by a revolutionary technique called macro X-ray fluorescence analysis, whatever that is. It was a painstaking and tedious work to restore about 160 square feet of painted surface. I was there one time. You were not allowed to take pictures or standing behind glass, and I watched this woman who was a conservator. I watched her for an hour, and she removed maybe a quarter, half an inch of paint. Very painstaking process. The international team consisted of 12 conservators. The project cost $4 million and was finally completed in January of 2024. And let me show you a few slides of what we're talking about. Again, the whole idea was to take the entire Ghent Altarpiece and all its wonderful color and return it to the color that was seen in 1432. You see here, this is Elizabeth Borloo, the wife of Josvate, the donor. On the left, you'll see the way it looked before the restoration, and you'll see on the right the original color. on the left then, on the right now. Now, the interesting thing about this, the robe on the left is much more colorful, a little bit more drab on the right, and that's what many people thought was kind of contentious about this. There were many people who were not in favor of this because they wanted to see the glorious color not as it was originally. And so this is the new display of the Ghent Altarpiece. The 20-foot tall climate-controlled bulletproof case in which the Ghent is now displayed cost $33 million. You can view the altarpiece at your own pace, spending as much time as you like. A regular ticket can be purchased online or at the cathedral for 12.5 euros. Or, and I would advise, you can do the augmented reality tour, which uses digital devices to provide an interactive experience, which explains the altarpiece's history and the cathedral's significance. The augmented reality tour is available in multiple languages. Tickets can be purchased online or at the cathedral for 16 euros. The cathedral is open from 10 to 5:30 Monday through Saturday and from 10 a.m. to 1:30 p.m. on Sundays. But before you go there, you really need to check to make sure the cathedral won't be closed due to a special event, such as the mayor's wedding, or as occurred to me one time, the mayor's funeral. Here are some of the sources I consulted for this webinar. Especially helpful at the bottom is the Web Gallery of Art. Its website is shown here. This is where I was able to get many of the details of the altarpiece for this presentation. I would really encourage you to go there to see additional details. After opening the website, you just simply go to Artists, where you can scroll over to Van Eyck and then to the altarpiece. And while you're there, spend some time looking at some other artists. And with that, we are finished. It's been a great pleasure to do this, and I hope it's inspired you to look further into the Ghent Altarpiece.
Hi there, Steve. Thanks so much. I think that was really interesting. People seem to like it. I've got a couple questions that came in, and let me get to them really quickly. I was trying to find you on my screen, and then I lost all my questions. Okay, can you tell us, and this question comes from Alicia, what percentage of the altarpiece did Jan van Eyck paint?
Oh, well, this, I think we covered this last time, but I'll go over it again. It's not been determined how much John and his brother Hubert painted. It's widely thought that Hubert's role was mainly in the original design. In other words, what panels are going to be in the altarpiece, where they're going to be positioned and so forth. It's widely thought that many of the nature scenes where you see ferns, you see date trees, birds in flight and so forth, roses, fruit and so forth, that those were painted by the younger Jan van Eyck, because he was the one who had traveled to southern Iberia, Spain and Portugal, where such things existed. And it was due to the fact that most of those plants and so forth, the flora and so forth, were not the kinds of plants that could have survived or thrived in Belgium, which can be very cold.
Excellent. I have one more question for you if you're good to answer, Steve.
Okay.
Let's see. This comes from Patty, and she wonders, what are the sort of contingency plans that are in place to protect the altarpiece today? I'm sure that it's been around long enough that folks have had an opportunity to figure out, plans for a heist again?
Well, the authorities apparently are convinced that the new display is unheistable. There's intense security. The glass is bulletproof. It's very heavy. I can't foresee it. Well, it's always possible for something like that to be stolen, but I think it'd be very, very difficult.
It seems like it would be difficult. I mean, it would take a lot of elbow grease, I would imagine, um, to get that out of there at this day for sure. Well, thank you so much, Steve. We really appreciate you taking the time to join us again. I think that's all for the questions that came in during the webinar. Thank you again for sharing with us. And as a reminder, a recording of this webinar as well as the part one of this Ghent Altarpiece series is available on our website. This one will be available later today. The other one is already up there. It's alumlc.org/MiamiOH. Thank you all for joining us, Steve, especially to you, and love and honor. Everyone have a good day.
It's been great. Very much appreciate it. Thanks.
Thanks, Steve.